Hi, good morning from San Francisco. Mimi, thank you so much for having me and great to meet everyone in the DC communicators community. By way of context, this is a topic I'm really passionate about. It really is a case that I have built based on some of my own suspicions around what is and is not working in go to market and in revenue generation today. And so I invite questions, comments, feedback. My intent here is to provide people with the data that I am seeing in the hopes that it will spark conversations with your CFO, your CEO, your board, and other folks so that you're building business models that are more efficient and also more customer friendly. So today, let's just level set for where we are. I think the word of the moment is uncertainty. I'm sure everyone would agree. Some of the challenges that we are all facing, whether we are in a company or whether we're in government or we're in the nonprofit space, we have a lot of instability. Markets are very crowded. That means there's a lot of different things that customers can buy, explore, et cetera. In the world of nonprofits, this means there are literally millions of nonprofits seeking donors and supporters and fundraising. It's a complicated time. The historic context of how we think about go-to-market models and funnels has been this very orderly process of eventual development and eventual success of a market. So basically, if you try hard enough, you can move appropriate buyers, donors through a funnel, and you will eventually retain them as customers. This is the hope. The problem with that is there really isn't a funnel. Anyone who's been experienced in the world of go to market in whatever sector sees this. These are all real data points. It's an unbelievably complex process to go from having a customer or a donor, having someone actually realize that they have a problem and navigating through their own concerns, needs, wants, and the dynamics of whatever organization they're a part of, making a decision about a product, an offer, a service, a corporate sponsorship, and ultimately navigating a preponderance of choices. This is a pretty common process for everyone. So how did we get here? First of all, let's just define what lead gen or demand generation are. And I'm using these terms interchangeably. Lead gen is this process of attracting prospects, potential customers into your organization through marketing. There is a concept of nurture, which is you are going to continuously share information with that target audience in the hopes that this will help you, the organization or the company, with a more predictable pipeline. And ultimately, there's a structured sales process. Most of the time, there's actually a sales organization, but you might have something that we call in tech product-led growth, which is a self-serve model. And that can still apply to lead gen because there is still this expectation of stages on the side of the company. So there are marketing stages and then there are sales stages. And a customer is expected to move through this again in that orderly process. Some of the common characteristics of the top frameworks are also worth a quick look. Predictable revenue is probably the most well-known of these frameworks. It was a book written in 2011. It documented the highly successful process at Salesforce. We'll talk about that more in a minute. HubSpot, another competitor, especially if you're a marketer or a salesperson, you're familiar with it. They also had this idea of inbound driven by content that, again, created this pipeline and this ongoing need for this CRM that they sell. And then one of the frameworks that is both legacy but also still referenced often is serious decisions. This started originally in 2002, and then it was refreshed about a decade later, and now it is owned by Forrester. And the commonality across these is there's an assumption about a high volume of leads, that is, prospects who are interested in whatever it is you do. There is a waterfall process across teams in go-to-market. So there's an idea that marketing does a set of activities, sales does a separate set of activities. There is often a customer success or customer experience team. They're doing something else. All of the roles and functions within firms that use these frameworks tend to be hyper specialized. You focus really intently on whatever it is you're doing and you don't worry about anything else and it all works out. Underpinning all of this is a process that optimizes this flow for the benefit of the company. Just do one little dive into what predictable revenue really looked like. So again, as I mentioned, 2011, Salesforce is blowing up. Salesforce pioneered cloud software. And if you're not very familiar with this world, it's almost hard to believe there was a time when we didn't have the cloud and we didn't have technology, services, apps, all of this kind of just in the ether. But this was the moment when it actually all came together. And this business model was pioneered by Mark Benioff at Salesforce. He was evangelizing a new way for companies to buy and use software. This was so successful. He was such a good thought leader with a really unique point of view. Other companies started adopting this model. If you look on the left-hand side, one of the things I find really interesting about it is Cold Call 2.0, a really integral piece of this process. These are some of the highlights of it. It capped prospecting emails at 200 a week because more than that would have been too much to manage. It had a cap on how many emails a seller should send a day, and it assumed a 10% response rate. These conditions are obviously of the moment. If you had this level of success today with lead gen, keep on keeping on because it's obviously working for you. Fantastic. This talk is probably not for you. Assuming that is not the condition of your business or your organization, some of the other gating criteria that made predictable revenue successful included low-cost digital ads. This was a time when ad networks were new. As buyers, we were not saturated. These were actually interesting and cool and unique for the time. Salesforce also was notable for splitting up the sales role. So this is where the SDR or the BDR, that's a sales development representative or business development representative, came from. What made sense at that time was to have this role that was qualifying buyers. The reason was there was so much demand for what Salesforce was doing that you really did need to have someone out there deciding if the leads were actually appropriate for the product that Salesforce was offering. What this did unintentionally was that it lengthened the traditional sales cycle. So it actually made it longer and more complex for both the company and the buyer to go through this. Ultimately, this model made life better for Salesforce. This was their way to manage this incredible moment that they built and were able to successfully harvest. But it wasn't particularly buyer-centric or customer-centric. Why is that important? Because lead gen is a high efficiency, high return on investment model. This is a crucial factor in determining whether or not lead gen makes sense for your organization. Here's how lead gen actually works. These are some of the unstated assumptions. First of all, that limitless number of qualified leads. That's just an amazing concept that virtually no business has today. But this also implies that there's no wasted effort. Ads were really inexpensive. And back when this model was developed, and the assumptions that still hold for this model are that this is still going to be inexpensive and it will also deliver qualified deals when you run these ads. It assumes that if you contact customers enough, that is actually an effective way to communicate instead of it being a turnoff. You yourself can think about whether or not you respond to a lot of cold outbound, or if you ever take a phone call, or if you even have a phone. There's also the question around endless future demand and the efficiency of a sales process. Both of these just don't carry through. The idea that you can just harvest demand forever is really not something that most companies or organizations get to enjoy, unfortunately. And buyers really don't love the process. Think about if you have ever been qualified by a seller. Did you enjoy that? Did you enjoy somebody asking you about your budget and your authority and when would you need this and how great was your need? Probably not. Lead gen, even more challengingly, does have some consequences that we should just touch on. It creates unsustainable expectations, and that leads to go-to-market dysfunction. I have seen this in a lot of companies that I have both worked in and have helped as clients. If you're in the nonprofit space or you're not in tech, think of product as your offer, your mission, whatever it is that your organization does. These are the challenges. In a world where the expectation is that things will never change and there is an infinite potential, you end up oftentimes with products that lack differentiation. That means that marketing is also spending time on leads that just don't convert. So this is when the marketing team is celebrating because they are meeting or exceeding their goals. And at the same time, the sales team is unfortunately running around trying to tackle anything that moves. And they're probably missing targets, missing quota. Today, a lot of sellers are at 30% of quota attainment. Not a great time to be a seller in an organization that doesn't have enough demand. Customer success, this is what I often refer to as the cleanup crew. Customer success in a lot of organizations that are dysfunctional ends up doing work across all of these functions. They're trying desperately to help and to be an advocate for customers. And at the same time, they are trying to patch problems in this go-to-market model. At the tail end, you have finance and legal. Their roles end up changing too, because none of this is working across other elements of your go-to-market. Oftentimes, the finance team gets really down in the weeds in pipeline management, in CAC, that means cost of customer acquisition. And I've even seen organizations where the sales team ends up reporting into finance, which is not optimal in terms of what you want each one of these teams to be doing in a healthy organization. So what's happening? More is not more. We have gone through a time of plenty. And if you think about this as a donor or a buyer, it's just really overwhelming because there are so many choices. A few data points here about how many companies and offerings we have. And I like this visual a lot, even if you're not in tech. You probably have some marketing technology in your organization. You probably have a CRM or something else. I think this marketing map that Scott Brinker does is just an incredible way to see what buyers are having to navigate. Or if you're in a company and you're building a product or you've got an offer, you have a nonprofit and you're trying to pitch to recruit more donors, you're navigating something similar to this. There are tens of thousands of competitive alternatives that are credible to the people you want to communicate with. This did not exist 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly not 15 years ago. We might have thought that those markets were crowded at the time, but now that we're in 2024 looking back, it is undoubtedly more noisy than it used to be. There's also a data point that comes from tech that I still think is helpful, even if you're not in tech and you're not in this venture ecosystem. And this is the problem of capital efficiency. This comes from an organization called Cowboy Ventures. Aileen Lee is the person who came up with the term unicorn, if you've ever heard that applied to a startup. 10 years ago, capital efficiency for enterprise companies was at 26x. Today, it's at 7x. There are notable signs that unicorns are still overvalued. You see some of this in the public markets too. The reason I bring it up here is the way that tech firms have been spending money and approaching go-to-market is really powerful. A lot of other sectors adopt these models. More importantly, it means there's a lot more money when you're going to bid on ads, keywords, other things. It makes everything more expensive for the entire ecosystem. At the same time, customers are not happy. This is data from Forrester, and it came out in June. Forrester noted that just 3% of companies are actually considered customer obsessed. You'll see the definition in the box on the right. What that means is across a span of 98,000 customers in the US and 223 brands, people are not happy. The factors driving that, they don't like the customer and employee experiences. Chatbots, we can all agree to that one. And there are macro concerns that are also affecting how buyers or donors are seeing the world. What we should really think hard about is, how has the world changed? Because one of the things that I have found in the data, and we're going to look through a whole bunch of it now, is that it is undeniably more challenging to acquire and influence customers, let alone to retain them. First of all, there has been a dramatic change in media consumption across the last 15 years. This data is from Statista, and the blue line up and to the right, that is digital. The black line down and to the right is traditional media, and it has absolutely flipped in the last decade. At the same time, acquisition costs are higher than ever. This is really important because if you are trying to grow, and in tech or in venture, we call it, scaling, this is going to collapse business models. Why is that? What you want when you're scaling is for the business model to get more efficient as you put more money into the system. If acquisition costs continue to rise as you put more money in, it collapses the engine. It makes your business really inefficient. There's some stats on the left-hand side about data, including from LinkedIn, and how much customer acquisition costs have increased in general. I've included some information from both public and private software as service companies, tech companies, because they're helpful benchmarks, even if that is not your sector. On the right-hand side, this is a case study from a company called Paceto, and it's using a data set from metadata, which you might be familiar with. This is also a really helpful look, particularly if you're a smaller organization. You might not have enough data to really assess if lead gen is going to work for you. So that's why this data set that had $42 million worth of spend in it is so helpful as a proxy. The core challenges here are the lead to win rate is so poor that it would take 333 leads to win one new customer. That is really bad. That means that the CAC payback for just advertising costs, the amount of time it would take for the money that you've invested to pay off for you, the organization, would be $57,000. And it's a 21-month CAC payback period. That doesn't include headcount. It doesn't include programs. It doesn't include marketing and sales, just advertising, which is not sustainable for a lot of organizations. It's also really hard to prove what works. I know there's a lot of data on this slide. I can share these slides after the fact, so you're welcome to look through this data and the sources and see what you think for yourself. Some of the highlights. After 2016 and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there are a number of changes that took place that you should really be thinking about when you're designing your own go-to-market model. One of them is attribution has gotten much harder. In particular, organic traffic has turned into dark traffic, which means that you're not going to see referral traffic. This will show up as direct traffic when you're actually looking this in Google, for example. That makes it very hard to actually tell you where this is coming from in a provable way. Platforms are also hoarding traffic. This is the rise of zero-click, which you have probably seen. But this is when you go to Google, you go to the SERP, and you're searching for something, and you get the answer to whatever it is, and you leave. Unfortunately, for the company or the organization that had that information, that means fewer people are coming to their website. Fewer people are seeing whatever else that they have to offer. So this is not great from the organization's perspective. The other challenge, too, is there's a huge measurement gap between what the attribution tool that you have tells you and what's happening in reality. And the reason for this is that attribution tools are going to be able to measure what is trackable. There's a difference between what is trackable and what is actually influential for buyers, for prospects, for other people who might be involved in a buying decision. We'll get into that in a minute. This universe looks nothing like the world in 2011. This is some really interesting data from McKinsey that I encourage you to take a look at. It is based on public markets. I wasn't able to find something similar for private markets, but I suspect something similar is going on. The core insight here is that the role of marketing has been atomized over the past 20 years. And that means you might have a customer officer, a growth officer, a marketing officer, demand gen lead, all sorts of different things are happening. And these overlapping functions are not only competing with one another, but none of them is actually getting leverage. They're not getting the scale of what you used to see when marketing was the 4 Ps. When marketing was one function that had more breadth, there is more power in that. You're 3x more likely if you're a B2C company to have greater than 5% growth, and 2x more likely if you're a B2B company, which is really interesting to think about if you're in an organization that has a lot of different cooks in the kitchen when it comes to marketing/customer growth. Now, on the sales side of the house, it's really important to talk about sales because sometimes sales gets a bad rap, and that's not the intention here. There are really strong sales organizations And there are situations in which having a strong sales team is absolutely something you should have as part of your go-to-market, but it doesn't apply to everyone. This is why. On the left-hand side, these are trackable tactics. We discussed some of them before, but these are the things that would actually show up in an attribution tool, or we would say, we got a lead from there. These are the things I can prove. The problem is, if you ask your own customers, they're going to tell you this too. They care about their past experience with vendors. They care about subject matter experts. And they also really care about industry and professional communities. That's actually where Mimi and I met. We met in Chief. It's an organization for executive women. I suspect that if you are a professional, particularly if you're a senior professional, there's at least one organization that you would go to and you would ask questions of if you were evaluating some big tool or service. Even in your personal life, you're going to go to a trusted counsel of friends or people you think are smart on an issue if you're trying to navigate something, including if you're a donor. This is important because the data is showing that people increasingly do not want to talk to sales unless and until sales is able to add value and answer specific questions. Let's think about this for a minute, because this is a really important point. In the prior model, in the lead gen world, the assumption was absolutely everyone wanted to talk to sales because you had an overabundance of demand. People were really excited about this, and sales could really add value in that process. It was the only way you were going to learn about this product. It was the only way you were going to get on the cloud. That was the mindset. Today, sales is often seen as a gatekeeper that is blocking access or making it more difficult for buyers. But let's look at some of this data. As we were starting with COVID, McKinsey did some research that I find endlessly fascinating. 70% of B2B buyers wanted to buy about the amount of $50,000. This is sight unseen. They would be happy to do this self-serve. 27% would spend as much as $150,000. And my favorite part, 12% of buyers would spend $1 million on something they had never experienced before, entirely self-serve. This data gets worse or better over time, depending on your perspective. By the time Trust Radius is looking at this just 2 years later, it's virtually 100% of companies that want to go self-serve. So the only time they want to engage a buyer is what Korn Ferry tells us, which is they already know their needs, and they believe that buyer is going to add value that they can't get otherwise. That buyer is going to help them build consensus, drive change, help them really understand risk, or it's a very complicated process. Something to keep in mind. The other thing that I think is important, there are two things on the right-hand side. One is there are far more stakeholders in the process today, particularly in B2B, than a lot of organizations appreciate. Data from G2 indicates there are 22 roles on the buyer journey. I have heard as many as 80 anecdotally. And if you look back to our labyrinth chutes and ladder slide, it's not hard to believe. Take a step back and think that your buyer or those donors are going through something similar for literally every category, every type of product or offering that is being pitched to them. It boggles the mind. All of this is driving what Bain and company provided in some data last fall, and that is that buyers already have a short list in mind when they're looking to solve a problem. 80 to 90% of them are picking someone they already know from that vendor short list. This is important because it means that getting on that short list becomes a huge priority. And it's harder than ever in a world in which no one will take your calls, they won't meet with you, they don't respond to your email. You're getting limited feedback and signals. The instinct of a lot of sellers and a lot of sales organizations and a lot of CEOs is just to push harder. And this is the wrong instinct. This data comes from the Jolt Effect book. I really love this book. I highly recommend reading it if you haven't. They analyzed more than 2 million sales calls during COVID. These are all virtual. And what they determined was on the left-hand side, 40 to 60% of deals were lost due to inaction. What does that mean? That means that the buyer has gone through an entire process with the sellers. The buyer has decided that the status quo does not work for them. And yet the buyer and the buying committee still won't make a decision. This is very concerning, and it's very expensive if you're an organization that is spending a lot of money on an expensive go-to-market team, especially on an expensive sales team. In the middle, you can see the effect of this level of indecision. The higher the indecision, the lower the win rates on deals. This data showed that almost 90% of sales conversations involve moderate to high levels of indecision. This is a huge problem for sales organizations to try to solve. The thing is, if you want to solve it, instead of pushing buyers and instead of really creating that urgency or the fear of missing out, that actually makes indecision worse. What you would have to do as a seller is prove to buyers that they won't fail. That is just not how most sales organizations are actually structured. You think about it, it's a really different sales motion. It's a different set of materials for marketing and different information that you would use to basically arm your buyer, arm your donor. So with all of that, I know it's overwhelming. It's probably a ton of data, but I get really excited about this. So thanks for bearing with me. We'll just recap what we know, and then we'll talk about what you can do with this. Media consumption isn't what it used to be. Buyers are absolutely overwhelmed by a preponderance of choices. It's gotten harder to reach customers, harder to influence them. It's more expensive, and it's harder to prove what works. When you do reach someone, they don't want to talk to the sales team. And if they do talk to the sales team, after all of this, it can still stall out because they might not believe that whatever it is you're offering is actually going to work and that they're not going to look bad and feel like they failed by picking you. This is very challenging. Here's what I think you should do. And the core insight that I want you to keep in mind is that I fundamentally believe that it's a mistake to just look at the competition or what you did in your last company, or if you have investors, to just wholesale accept whatever it is that they think meets the moment. What you really need to do is design a system that works for your organization. And what I mean by that is it has to work for your customer base. That's your price point, that's your product or service or whatever mission it is that your organization offers if you're a nonprofit. These are the 4 core elements that I think need to be a crucial part of that go-to-market model. We'll discuss these as we go. They are, you need to validate that target audience over time. And I say this all the time, the world has changed and your customers, again, are being bombarded by other ideas and information. So this is something that's very important. It is foundational to everything else that you want to do. Second, you need to mine unique insights that benefit your customers. Third, this is a big change for marketing and sales organizations. Instead of trying to attract and gather leads and calling it job done, what you're really trying to do is unbundle your marketing and sales so that you are allowing buyers on their own time to discover, learn, whatever it is you want to teach them. This is a really hard one because this is less control than a lot of organizations would like. But what I would urge is the change has already happened. The tidal wave has hit. If you try to maintain control, all you're going to do is drive up costs and ultimately not be as successful as you could be if you acknowledge that there is more agency on the part of buyers. And finally, to make this all work, you have to change the KPIs and the metrics, because a lot of what is underpinning and driving lead gen is that marketing teams are forced to gather leads. Because in that waterfall model, it made sense, right? Like we get a lot of leads, even if it's inefficient, we don't care because it's inexpensive. And we just go down the line and ultimately the math works out. Except today, the math isn't working out. Here's how it works. Big question. Are you my customer? Don't assume. On the left-hand side, what I would really encourage you to do as an organization is to think hard about when you last updated your segmentation. When you look out at your addressable market or all the donors that could potentially support your organization, how do you know that the people you're targeting are in fact the best fit for whatever it is you do? Each one of those pies is, as you acquire a new segment, you have 2 goals. If you look on the right-hand side, you are trying to retain existing customers and you're trying to serve new customers. There are 4 things to keep in mind in this ongoing process of customer validation and segmentation. First of all, the market has the need or the value, the willingness to pay changed, because this will be different at every stage of both your organization and the wider market. The offer If you have a new offer, if your product has evolved, or if you have a competitive alternative out there that's really strong and yours is now weaker, you're going to have to figure this out again. And it's important to keep in mind, it's not just product market fit, it's product market pricing fit. Why is that important? Because willingness to pay changes depending on need and what a customer actually cares about. We will discuss that in just 1 minute. And as I said before, you have two jobs. You need to retain the people that are already your customers or your backers or your donors, and you want to grow and expand. And these are slightly different strategies, because one thing that I have seen in a lot of companies is that people seem to forget that as we're going after new exciting markets, especially if we're moving from, let's say, an SMB market up to an enterprise market, we have a shiny object problem where we might be going after bigger, better customers or donors. We still need to take care of those small dollar donors or the smaller company if we want them. Now, we might make a strategic choice that we don't, but it should be a conscious choice and not just have those folks like drift away because we were ignoring them. This is part of the process, and I talk about this all the time. It's important to keep in mind that you don't own value as an organization. This really sends shockwaves through companies, particularly companies in tech or in the venture world, because I think that sometimes we feel like we do, in fact, get to determine what our customers care the most about. And it's just not true. On the left-hand side, you own what you build, what you offer, what you deliver. The benefits, this is your hypothesis. This is the anticipated utility of whatever it is you're doing. So this is what benefit I think you will get from my amazing widget or my incredible nonprofit. On the right-hand side, the bottom, when we validate this by customers, we go through a segmentation process, we actually do the market research, we do the deep work. What we're doing is validating value, which means we are determining how much our customers care. And we measure that by willingness to pay. Because it's not that a problem isn't important. Most problems go into a bucket of saving time and saving money if you're in the business world. Those are important things. But saving 3 minutes on a widget may or may not make sense when I have 100 other priorities. And that's what you need to know as an organization. What are the priorities and where do you fall on those priorities for your best fit target customers? Once you know that, this is the payoff. You get to actually determine the value and pricing metrics that make the most sense. And this may feel a little bit less applicable to nonprofits, except that a lot of nonprofits have started offering services and products outside of just their core mission. And so if you've got a product lineup, it's still worth going through a process like this, because once you know what buyers really care the most about, you can change your business model. Maybe they are transactional. Maybe they want a subscription. It really depends on the buyer preferences. What I have found in my work is that a lot of companies set up business models based on what the company wants, or again, we're in business to make money. Maybe we get a better valuation, or maybe there's some other benefit to a business model that we're choosing. That may even be right for a subset of our market. It may be right for a segment, but it's quite possible that business model isn't appropriate for everyone. So when we segment the market, we can better tailor business models and the go-to-market to each one of those segments. Segmentation delivers a huge list of benefits. I won't go through all of these, but I can't stress enough how much value you get out of doing a regular customer insights program that involves a segmentation. And I know there are a lot of folks out there, especially if we're following the political world today, a lot of polling data and a lot of questions around what actually works in customer insights. This kind of work is a moment in time, but it is better than nothing. And it absolutely gives you a perspective that you just can't get if you're only looking at your own internal data, or you're polling your sales team, or you're polling the fundraising team. You are missing that voice of the customer. And what you need is to get that information at scale. That's how you're able to improve your roadmap, improve your offering, have a better product lineup, get key messages that make sense. And ultimately, this will help you design that go-to-market model and playbook in a way that actually makes more sense to your customers. The other thing that we really couldn't talk enough about is how important it is to build trust, especially in a time when you just don't have as much access to your buyers. It is important to provide value to your customers that they don't get elsewhere. And if you are a smart, credible professional, I am sure that you have something to offer the people that you want to communicate with and that you want as customers. And the key to this is really finding that unique insight. So on the right-hand side is a model. The reason that I'm such a proponent for thought leadership, and I know this term gets overused, so bear with me, is that it is high information, high value, and it's hard to copy when you do it well. But it is really important to get this right. It's not enough to have a bunch of content out there talking about yourself that really adds no value. Buyers are very smart and they will see through that. I define thought leadership as being additive, newsworthy, and educational. Another form of content that can be really helpful, I've had great success with it, is educational content. It serves slightly different function and purpose. If you're in financial services or healthcare, an area where there is a lack of even the basic level of knowledge about a problem, that can still be a really helpful way to educate your customer base if you're being honest and accurate. If it's scammy, then again, you're not going to build trust. But I think both of these are really good approaches with a heavy preference towards thought leadership for reasons we will discuss right now. Thought leadership, unlike any other form of content that you might consider, is going to accelerate your buying process. It builds credibility, particularly with executives and with leaders. And at the end of the day, it's also preferenced in algorithms, particularly in search. Information gain, which is what Google calls it, is rewarded. This is the gift that keeps on giving if you really commit to developing unique insights and packaging them up for customers. What does that look like? This is dense, so we'll come back to it because I know we're going to run long otherwise. But the most important thing is that on the left-hand side, that you identify your unique point of view. What are you trying to change in the world? Who is it for? Is this a non-obvious insight? Is this something that you uniquely can offer? And does your audience get more value from this than you do? This is an important point that I want to emphasize because I think that a lot of organizations are overly transactional and they miss this benefit because it feels scary. If you think about it from a perspective of if you are teaching your customers, even if they don't buy from you and they get some value, that builds trust. I guarantee you they will come back when they actually do have a need for it. Now, if you're a CFO or a CEO or even an investor, you're going to say, hey, that might not be fast enough. And yes, you should still do other marketing and try to accelerate that process to the extent you can. But as we've discussed, a lot of that is really out of your control. And so what you want to do is add more value before you make the ask. And this process can really help you with that. It's also important that the way that you deliver messages needs to fundamentally change. It cannot stay the way it is. We'll just touch on this very quickly. On the left-hand side, this is content that you would see on a website. So it's landing pages, it's blog. These are just some screenshots of some PDF downloads in lead gen on LinkedIn versus social media content. And this is David Spitz over at Bench Sites. He is someone I would call a thought leader. He has a really interesting set of data around acquisition costs. The difference in social media content is it's unbundled, it's highly educational. Some of it is based on internal data that the wider world wouldn't see. Sometimes it's based on interviews in the case of Lenny's podcast, or it might be a mix of customer insights and internal data in the case of the Revenue Vitals podcast. There's a real range of things you can do, but each one of the programs that works is appropriate for that business and it's appropriate for their ideal customers. Even if I never buy from any of these companies, I get value from every one of these. I learn something every time, and that builds trust. Just this week, I shared one of these firms with somebody that I know as a high recommendation, even though I've been one of their customers. But I like their content so much, it has built so much trust and respect in my eyes that I'm willing to give that as a recommendation to someone who could benefit from it. And you, on the other end, if you were the marketer or the salesperson, the CFO, you would never know that I did that. That's the tricky challenge for a lot of organizations. That's why what we want to do is prioritize the information consumption and the distribution versus lead gen, because lead gen assumes that we need to get your name so that we can harass you and then trick you into a meeting or convince you to take a meeting, in which case we're going to bombard you with all this information. And the world just doesn't work like that. If we instead unbundle that information and we share it so that you can consume it on your own time, it is a far more efficient process in every sense of the word, and customers really prefer it too. The last piece of this is the business goals. We have to change the metrics. And this is a conversation in which you need to be best friends with your CFO, also your board, and your CEO. This is a come to Jesus moment. The questions on the left, these are the tactical questions most marketing organizations get. And sales orgs also get similar questions around like, how many meetings did you book, or demo requests, or whatever. I think that's fine if that's an indicator, a trend. But if that is what you are goaled on as an organization, your org is totally missing. Instead, the questions you need to be asking are across both teams. And I would bring customer success into this too. If your customer success people have revenue goals, you need to know if both marketing and sales are working. You don't want your marketing team to win when the sales team is losing. There is no benefit to your business in doing that. I would highly recommend not doing that, in fact. It's also helpful to have those conversations on a regular basis. Are we overinvested in sales? Is marketing actually targeting the right channels? Do we even need SDRs? If you don't have a lot of lead volume, here's a hint. I bet you don't need SDRs. I'll bet you could just have full stack sellers and probably fewer of them and have happier customers and a more efficient business model. It's worth exploring. And these are serious ongoing conversations. This wasn't built in a day. The end of the day, what you want to do is stop the transactional work that used to work, because it doesn't anymore. The things that you can prove are just not as valuable as the things that actually influence customers and get through the barrier of not taking calls and not meeting with sales. It's really important to orient yourself so that you are making it easier for customers to learn from you instead of making it harder. You want to own the pipeline. You want to partner with finance on the KPIs. I think that when you have shared goals, you are going to reduce the number of credit wars between teams. That's a huge drag on a lot of companies that I've seen. And in general, you want to reduce bad friction. If you've read the book by Bob Sutton at Stanford, there's a awesome book called Friction Fixers that I would highly recommend. You want to take that out of the buying journey, because when you do, that is when you can really shine, and your product, your service, whatever it is, whatever mission you're trying to accomplish, is actually going to be more easily consumed and adopted by the people that you're targeting. Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review, follow the show, or share it with a friend. We're a news show, so it really helps other listeners find us. And if you have feedback, comments, or suggestions for episodes or guests, please reach out to us. You can find our information in the show notes.